What the mainstream press won't tell you is that we are standing at one of those rare civilizational pivot points, the kind that textbooks will argue about for the next 50 years. And it is happening right now in real time in a narrow strip of water just 21 miles wide that separates a wounded Iran from the coast of Oman. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is the jugular vein of the global economy. And today, American warships are wrapped around it like a fist. As of April 18th, 2026, Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz again in direct response to Washington's refusal to lift its naval blockade. And the world is holding its breath, pretending this is normal, pretending this is manageable, pretending this is just another geopolitical chess move. It is not. This is the moment where American imperial overreach collides head-on with the physical limits of global energy architecture. And the consequences are going to land on every single one of you, whether you are paying attention or not. The head of the International Energy Agency has called this the worst energy shock the world has ever seen, more severe than the oil crises of the 1970s and the Ukraine war combined. Let that land for a second. More severe than the 1973 Arab oil embargo that brought the United States to its knees. More severe than the Russian invasion of Ukraine that shattered European energy security. More severe than anything we have collectively experienced in modern economic history. And yet here in America, the conversation is still being filtered through a narrow political lens of maximum pressure on Iran and freedom of navigation, as if this were simply a bilateral standoff between Washington and Tehran, and not the most consequential disruption to global energy flows in recorded history. Let us go back a little to understand how we arrived at this moment, because context is everything, and without it, you are just consuming noise. Tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel had been escalating for months, stemming from failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a prior 12-day air conflict in 2025. The regime in Tehran had been signaling for a long time that Hormuz was their ultimate card, their deterrent, their leverage against an American-Israeli strategic posture that had been squeezing Iran economically, militarily, and diplomatically for decades. Nobody in Washington wanted to believe they would actually play it. They played it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. That is not a minor diplomatic incident. That is regime decapitation. That is the kind of act that rewrites regional history in ways that take decades to fully understand. And what followed was entirely predictable to anyone who has spent serious time understanding Iranian strategic doctrine. Tehran did not fold. Tehran activated its geography. Before the war began, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil, more than 20 million barrels per day, passed through the Strait of Hormuz daily. That flow has since collapsed to almost nothing. By early April, shipments through the strait had fallen to around 3.8 million barrels per day, compared with more than 20 million barrels per day in February. That is an 80% reduction in flow through the most critical energy choke point on the planet. Think about what that actually means for supply chains, for refinery feedstocks, for the industrial infrastructure of Asia, for the price of everything that gets made, transported, or heated using fossil fuels. Now enter the blockade. After nuclear and maritime talks collapsed in Islamabad on April 11th, after J.D. Vance himself walked out of negotiations and declared them failed, President Trump declared a U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, announcing that the U.S. Navy would prevent ships from entering or exiting Iranian ports and coastal areas and intercept ships that had paid tolls to Iran. On the surface, the framing coming out of Washington was careful and legalistic. U.S. Central Command clarified that the blockade would target vessels connected to Iranian ports, not all transit through the strait itself. But the reality on the water is far messier, far more volatile, and far more consequential than any press release from the Pentagon can capture. CENTCOM is employing more than a dozen warships, over 100 aircraft, and more than 10,000 personnel in blockade enforcement. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier is there. The USS Tripoli amphibious assault ship is there, with Marines trained to board vessels. 11 destroyers are operating in the region. U.S. forces can interdict ships carrying Iran-linked cargo tens of thousands of miles away. A commercial ship can be targeted in international waters long after it leaves the strait. This is not just a blockade of a port or a coastline. This is a projection of American military power across an enormous maritime theater, with the explicit intent to strangle the economic lifeline of a nation of 90 million people. And here is where you need to start thinking beyond the Iran-US frame, because the ripple effects of this blockade are hitting countries that have nothing to do with the conflict, that did not sign up for this war, and that are now being forced to choose sides in ways that will reshape global alliances for a generation. Let us talk about China first, because China is where this story gets truly explosive. Roughly 98% of Iranian oil exports are bound for China, and a Trump-Xi summit is scheduled for mid-May. Washington has been walking a tightrope, trying to maintain enough pressure on Iran to force a nuclear capitulation while not blowing up the fragile diplomatic relationship with Beijing ahead of what could be a historic meeting. That tightrope just got a lot thinner. Over half of China's oil imports pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and Beijing has warned explicitly that access to shipping must be guaranteed. What has China actually done? Beijing has not sent warships to challenge the US Navy directly. That would be escalatory beyond anything the current situation can absorb. Instead, China has played a longer game. Early in the conflict, reports emerged that Iran was allowing only Chinese vessels to pass through the strait, citing China's supportive stance toward Tehran. And according to Lloyd's List, payments being assessed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards for transit were being collected in Chinese yuan. Read that again slowly. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards were running a toll booth at the world's most important energy choke point, and they were denominating those tolls in renminbi, not dollars. That is not just a commercial transaction. That is a statement about what currency governs energy security in the emerging world order. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reportedly accused China of being an unreliable global partner during the conflict, criticizing Beijing for hoarding oil supplies instead of easing the global crunch. But that accusation reveals more about Washington's expectations than it does about Chinese behavior. China was never going to sacrifice its own energy security on the altar of American strategic objectives. China has been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. China's strategic and commercial oil stocks, combined with barrels in transit, cover well over 120 days of net imports. They built those reserves precisely because they knew this day would come. Not necessarily this specific conflict, but some version of a moment where American power would attempt to weaponize global energy flows against countries that Beijing considers partners or allies. Now look at India, and this is where the human reality of this crisis becomes impossible to ignore. India imports more than 85% of its crude oil requirements, around 5.5 million barrels per day, making it the world's third largest oil importer. Unlike China, India does not have a deep strategic reserve buffer. India has reserves of roughly 160 million barrels, representing only about 30 days against prolonged supply shocks. 30 days. That is the margin between normal functioning and economic crisis for the world's most populous nation. And the blockade is hitting India at exactly the worst moment. The US waiver allowing countries to purchase Russian crude expired on April 11th, the same day the Iran talks collapsed. India had been buying 1.5 million barrels per day of Russian crude under that waiver. Now that lifeline is gone too. The squeeze is coming from multiple directions simultaneously. India is already experiencing LPG shortages, rupee pressure, and emergency policy interventions to manage fuel costs. For hundreds of millions of Indian households, LPG is not a luxury. It is how they cook their food. It is how they heat water. It is one of the most basic necessities of daily life, and India does not maintain meaningful strategic LPG reserves. India holds no significant LPG stockpile, and reserves at refiners and distributors could cover only 2 to 3 weeks of demand if imports stall. We are not talking about stock market volatility or abstract macroeconomic indicators. We are talking about the possibility of hundreds of millions of people in one of the world's largest democracies losing access to cooking fuel because two powers on the other side of the globe cannot resolve a nuclear standoff. And what is the geopolitical consequence of squeezing India this hard? New Delhi has been Washington's great strategic hope in Asia. The democratic counterweight to China, the cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the partner that was supposed to anchor American influence in the region for the next 50 years. But India, even as it tilts toward the US, is increasingly finding that Washington's policies work to its detriment, particularly in matters of energy security. Every barrel of disrupted supply, every rupee of currency depreciation, every LPG shortage in an Indian village is a data point that Indian strategic planners are recording and analyzing. The lesson they are drawing is not that America is an unreliable partner. The lesson is more dangerous than that. The lesson is that American strategic interests and Indian economic survival are simply not aligned on the most fundamental questions of energy and sovereignty. Let us zoom out further to the global economic picture because the numbers coming out of the International Energy Agency are staggering. Global oil supply plummeted by 10.1 million barrels per day to 97 million barrels per day in March, representing the largest supply disruption in history. OPEC plus production fell by nearly 9.5 million barrels per day in a single month. Middle East and feedstock-constrained refineries in Asia have cut runs by around 6 million barrels per day in April. The petrochemical supply chains that feed everything from plastics to pharmaceuticals to synthetic textiles are under severe stress. The disruption is not just oil, it is the entire molecular infrastructure of the modern industrial economy, and much of that infrastructure was designed around the assumption that Hormuz would always flow freely. Analysts have warned that even if a resolution were reached tomorrow, it could take up to 2 years for the energy market to return to normal, citing severely damaged energy infrastructure in the region. 2 years. That is 2 years of elevated energy prices, 2 years of compressed industrial output, 2 years of inflationary pressure feeding into the cost of every good and service in the global economy. The post-2008 world was shaped by the financial crisis. The post-COVID world was shaped by supply chain collapse and inflation. The post-Hormuz world is going to be shaped by a fundamental reevaluation of energy security, supply chain geography, and the reliability of American-led global order. There is also the question of legality, which is almost entirely absent from the American mainstream media conversation about this blockade, and that absence is itself telling. Under international law, specifically the rules governing international straits, the U.S. has no legal authority to close, suspend, or impede transit passage through Hormuz. Only Iran and Oman are coastal states, and even they are prohibited from suspending transit passage. What Washington has done is assert the right to enforce a unilateral economic blockade in one of the most internationally critical waterways on Earth, based on its own interpretation of its own strategic interests, without authorization from the United Nations Security Council, without a formal declaration of war and an explicit defiance of established maritime law. The rest of the world is watching this and drawing conclusions about what American leadership of the international order actually means in practice. A senior NATO military official told CBS News that the UK is leading planning efforts of a coalition of more than 40 nations to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and protect freedom of navigation. But notice the framing. It is the UK leading a coalition to reopen the strait, implicitly acknowledging that the strait is currently not open and that American policy is part of the problem. Trump himself responded by saying he was very disappointed in NATO and that they weren't there for us. The alliance that was supposed to be the bedrock of Western strategic cohesion is fracturing in real time, publicly, over a crisis that Washington engineered through a combination of military action and diplomatic maximalism. It will be more expensive for the US to maintain its blockade than it was for Iran to close the strait. That asymmetry is crucial and almost never discussed in American policy circles. Iran closed the strait by threatening ships mining the waterway and using its geography as a weapon. The cost to Tehran was relatively low. The cost to Washington of sustaining a naval interdiction operation across the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea with aircraft carriers, destroyers, marines, surveillance aircraft, and the entire logistical tail that supports them is enormous and escalating by the day. Prior to the conflict, an average of 138 ships passed through the strait daily. The US Navy simply does not have the capacity to intercept, inspect, and redirect that volume of traffic indefinitely, and the longer this drags on, the more the operational and financial costs will test American political will. What we are really watching here is not just a crisis over a shipping lane. What we are watching is the stress test of American hegemony itself, the moment where the post-1945 architecture of US-led globalization meets the hard wall of multipolarity. The American empire has long defined its global role in terms of guaranteeing the freedom of the seas. That guarantee was the foundation of the dollar-based trading system, the engine of American financial power, and the source of Washington's ability to project its values and interests across every ocean on Earth. But a guarantee is only meaningful if it is universal. The moment the United States uses control of the seas as a weapon against specific nations, as a tool of economic coercion, it undermines the very principle that justified American naval dominance in the first place. The countries of the global South, from India to Malaysia to the nations of sub-Saharan Africa who depend on Gulf LPG for basic cooking fuel, are not experiencing this crisis as a geopolitical abstraction. They are experiencing it as a concrete daily reality of rising prices, disrupted supply chains, and energy insecurity. And they are asking a question that should alarm anyone in Washington who is thinking seriously about the long-term architecture of American influence. If the United States can weaponize the Strait of Hormuz today against Iran, what is to stop a future administration from weaponizing some other choke point against some other country that refuses to comply with American demands? For now, the waterway remains open but volatile, with global energy flows moving through a corridor where the next incident could quickly reignite the crisis. Every ship that transits the strait today does so with war risk insurance premiums that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, with military escorts that cost taxpayers across multiple nations tens of millions of dollars per convoy, and with the constant awareness that a single miscalculation, an Iranian fast attack boat that gets too close to an American destroyer, a mining incident, a drone strike on the wrong vessel, could send oil prices to $150 a barrel overnight and push the global economy into a recession that makes 2008 look like a minor correction. The Hormuz crisis is not going to be resolved by naval power alone. It never was. The people in Washington who thought that Operation Epic Fury would produce a quick, clean capitulation from Tehran fundamentally misread Iranian strategic culture, Iranian institutional resilience, and the Iranian willingness to impose enormous costs on the global economy in service of national survival. Iran does not have the option of capitulating on its nuclear program and remaining a functioning state. The regime, whatever its legitimacy deficits, understands that nuclear capability is the only thing standing between it and the fate of Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. That calculation does not change under military pressure. It hardens. What changes the calculation is diplomacy, and diplomacy requires the United States to offer something that Iran can actually accept, not maximalist demands for complete nuclear dismantlement presented as ultimatums, but a genuine framework that addresses Iranian security concerns while establishing verifiable limits on weapons-grade enrichment. Since neither side has explicitly stated that talks will not resume or that the ceasefire is over, all these moves should be treated as tactics and threats within ongoing negotiations. There is still a window. It is narrowing. And the cost of letting it close completely is not borne primarily by Washington or Tehran. It is borne by the billions of people around the world whose economies, whose food systems, whose basic energy access depend on 21 miles of water flowing freely between the Iranian coast and the Sultanate of Oman. This is the real story of the Hormuz crisis. Not a story about American strength, not a story about Iranian aggression, not a story about freedom of navigation as an abstract principle. It is a story about the collision between the logic of empire and the logic of survival, playing out in the most consequential maritime choke point in human history, with the entire architecture of the global economy hanging in the balance. Pay attention. The decisions being made right now today in Washington and Tehran and Beijing and New Delhi are going to shape the world your children inherit.